Welcome to the klutchkittengaming podcast, where I play an indie game for 5 hours and let you know whether or not it's worth your time and money. Hello and welcome everyone, this is James, also known as Clutch Kitten, and I am so excited that you're here for episode 29 of the show. I'll have you know that I originally had planned to do some sort of love-themed game because Valentine's Day was yesterday, but for some reason I chose to do a game about murder. Even though that's the case, I hope all of you had a wonderful day of love, and whether you're with a new boyfriend or girlfriend, a long-term significant other, or you're just even rolling solo, I love it when you join me for the podcast. You are actually the ones that motivate me to keep putting these episodes out, and I'm such a fan of the community built around this podcast and just gaming in general. Before we get into this week's news, I actually have a couple small things to mention. I want to quickly tell you about the show's email and Instagram. They are both wonderful ways to interact with me and ask me questions for the show. You can find the show's Instagram at klutchkittengaming, and you can also email me at klutchkittengaming@gmail.com. This week I actually received a bunch of questions from some friends on Instagram, and I thought it would be fun to answer just a couple on the show. The first question comes from Josh G, who asked, "Do you ever lie about your 5-hour game time?" This question actually made me laugh a lot. I figured it would come up at some point since my intro does say that I play a game for 5 hours. Josh got on to me because the answer is mostly yes, especially if you're a technical prick like myself. Yes, I do lie in the sense that I don't have a timer going down to the minute when I'm playing a game. First of all, if I review a game like What Remains of Edith Finch, where I can literally play the game in less than 5 hours, I don't go back to it just to get more time in. Secondly, I might play a game for longer than 5 hours if I really like it, or I just feel like I need to get more time in for the review. I usually try and mention how long I actually play when we get around to the length of the game, but sometimes I don't. The other question I wanted to answer was from Game and Scotch. By the way, two very good things. Game and Scotch says, "Do you remember your first video game experience?" That's actually such a tough question because I feel like I have a lot of jumbled memories around games, and I don't necessarily know which ones came first. I'll mention a few memories that stick out though. So my parents were not big fans of video games, at least traditional ones, so in order to get a lot of my gaming in early on, I went to Jonathan's house, my neighbor at the time. We played a lot of Super Mario World on the Super Nintendo, as well as Backyard Soccer on the PC if you remember that one. We also played some weird Scooby-Doo game as well. I honestly don't remember what it was, but I remember it being fun. Some of the first gaming memories I have from my home include lots of learning company games like Operation Neptune, where you have to answer math equations to move, and Carmen Sandiego. I also remember playing Lego Racers with my brother, if you guys remember that, but I do feel like that was a bit later on in my childhood. Josh and Game and Scotch, thank you both for your questions. It's a ton of fun hearing from all of you. Let's move on now to this week's news. Since it feels like we've gotten into some pretty heavy news in the past few weeks, let's keep it light this time around with two small but exciting things. First off, if you listened to episode 15 about Dead Cells and ended up buying it, you'll be happy to hear that a patch with some pretty nice features has been released on all consoles as of Valentine's Day. I haven't tried it yet, but according to the patch notes, a new custom game mode has been released, which allows you to customize your runs by doing things like unlocking and relocking items, enabling special gameplay adjustments, changing rules, and doing a bunch of other things. I won't go through the entire patch because it's huge, but another great change is that the mob auto-scaling mechanic has been removed. So basically now the levels have a fixed difficulty instead of scaling in weird ways. I'm definitely planning to go back to Dead Cells after this patch, and hopefully you get a chance to do so as well. The other piece of news I want to mention is about Deltarune. This is an Undertale sort of short sequel, which Toby Fox, the creator, released on PC for free a few months back. The exciting current news is that on February 28th, Deltarune is coming out on Nintendo Switch for free as well. So, if you're like me and haven't touched Undertale before, or haven't played Deltarune on the PC, but feel like messing around with this sequel, you might as well pick it up because it will be free. Let's transition now to this week's game. Today we're going to be talking about The Hex. This is an unusual game because at its core it's a murder mystery adventure, but it ends up jumping around to different genres at a very steady clip. In one moment you're playing a side-scrolling platformer, in the next moment you're playing a turn-based RPG, and in the moment after that you're playing a twin-stick shooter, and so on. We'll get more into why that is in a bit, but it's important to keep that in mind going forward. The Hex was released on October 16th of 2018 for PC, Mac, and Linux, and was developed by Daniel Mullins Games. According to the DMG website, Daniel does most of the development himself in Vancouver, BC, although it sounds like Jonas Sensel has helped him out with the music and sound work. The only other release under the DMG banner is Pony Island, which came out in January of 2016. The Hex currently costs just shy of $10 on Steam, and according to howlongtobeat.com, the game generally takes between 5.5 to 7.5 hours to beat. It's a dark and stormy night, and you find yourself sitting at the bar of the Six Pint Inn. The Six Pint is usually a quiet place to stay. It sits just outside of town and has about as much character as it has holes in the wall. And it has a lot of holes in the wall. The concierge is ancient, and the place feels as old as he is. Tonight is odd because there's an incredibly diverse group of people hanging around the bar. A sorceress, a weasel, a space marine. Need I go on? What makes this night even more abnormal is the fact that the concierge just received word about a murder committed by someone in the room with you. The premise of the Hex is pretty straightforward. Figure out who committed the murder. However, before we get into how that's done, I need to mention something that's important about the characters involved. It's not as though each person at the bar is just wearing some unique clothes. What's especially peculiar is that each character comes from a different video game. Lazarus comes from a space twin-stick shooter, Super Weasel Kid comes from a side-scrolling platformer, the Faceless character comes from a first-person game, Chandrell comes from a turn-based RPG, and Bryce comes from a cooking game. My earlier comment about this game being hard to pin down genre-wise might be making a little bit more sense now because in your quest to find out about the murder, you end up learning about each character through playing their respective games. This brings us to one of the incredible strengths of the narrative, the meta humor. The format of this game, where it jumps into such a wide array of genres, actually gave Daniel a wonderful opportunity to comment on gaming in general. What's funny is that we as gamers often get so steeped in gaming culture and what's normal in games, that we don't always take a moment to step back and see how ridiculous some of it is. This isn't an exhaustive list by any means, but the Hex touches on the following: how dumb tutorials can be, the nasty trend of bad sequels, grinding to overlevel, Twitch chats, the morality of modding, OP characters in games, dating sims, the effects of Steam reviews, and yes, the Hex even references the Battle Royale genre. Let's get into a couple quick examples of how this commentary is given. In the turn-based RPG where you play as Chandrell, every so often a chat bar will pop up on the side of your in-game screen. If you get a crit on an enemy, all of these fake people in chat will be spamming emotes or screaming about how much damage you just did, just like if you were streaming on Twitch. When you encounter one of the bosses, there's a guy named Bandito in your chat who keeps telling you the solution, and as a result gets banned. His ban then triggers the rest of your chat to spam #FreeBandito, and a little while later, a new user with the name BanditoFUMods comes back to give you even more hints in the game. He also throws in a nice little fuck you to the mods. Honestly, at that moment, I was watching the chat bar even more closely than the game because of how damn funny it was. Something else to mention on the chat front was that this game uses your Steam friends list to populate some of those fake chatters, which was super weird when I first saw it. I looked over and saw some names that were familiar, and at first I thought I was just seeing things, but the closer I looked, the more I saw my friends' usernames scrolling by. There's another part of the RPG where you're trying to reach a boss, and a character tells you about a shortcut you can take. Being the experienced gamer that I am, I realized that the correct thing to do was to not take the shortcut, because what might I miss by doing that? So, I went the long way, and let me tell you, it was a long, boring way where I was constantly reminded that I chose grinding over a quick route. That sort of meta humor is pervasive in the Hex, and it made me laugh out loud countless times. It struck a nice balance of making a point and being self-referential without being obnoxious. The way that Daniel designed the humor was so clever because he also made it in such a way that even non-gamers could appreciate the jokes. Think about it this way. If you were someone who had never played an RPG or MMO, you probably would not understand the term grinding, at least in the context of video games. As a result, any joke about grinding would fly over your head, but the way Daniel addressed this was to give you a little taste of what the joke was about. Why crack such an in-your-face joke about how dumb grinding can be, when you can just give the player a small-scale experience of grinding out literally the same enemy 30 times in a row? Trust me, if I was someone who didn't understand grinding out levels before I took the long route, I sure as hell would have understood it after that. The second standout aspect to the Hex in terms of narrative was definitely the story arc as a whole. This is actually really hard to talk about because I can't fully explain how weird and crazy this game is without getting into spoilers. Because of that, and because it's worth not being spoiled on the game, all I will say is that the complete story of the Hex will blow your mind. Last episode, I talked about how What Remains of Edith Finch took me on an emotional roller coaster that was a reflective and impactful experience. Similarly, the Hex played with my emotions, but it was on a much different level. This game had me laughing one moment, and on the edge of my seat, almost scared shitless the next. If it wasn't clear already, the writing is incredible in this game, and I believe it's absolutely core to the experience. We've touched on the gameplay briefly, but let's look in some more detail at the Hex's mechanics. What are you going to be doing in this game, and how do the mechanics feel? The first thing that's important to mention is controls. For nearly everything you do in this game, all you need are the movement keys and a left click on your mouse. Control-wise, this game is very simple, but what impressed me was seeing the variety of gameplay that Daniel showcased within those constraints. When you're in the Six Pint Inn, the game is actually a bit of a puzzle clicker. There are secret doors, people to talk to, items you can hold or swap out, and new places to discover. When you're in the side-scrolling platformer, even though you only have a movement and jump button, dimension was added to the gameplay by giving you a 3-part jump, which gave you more range the more you jumped in succession. When you're in the turn-based strategy game, you only have access to a move and a basic attack, but depth was added into those puzzles through the mods that were added in. And by mods, I don't mean actual mods that you get through the Steam Workshop, I mean fake in-game mods that added wacky ways to play. Daniel did such a great job of adding in complexity within the confines of such a simple control scheme. However, I also don't want to give off the impression that the mechanics in this game are actually complex or that each genre vignette is even exceptionally good. This is a very different game from What Remains of Edith Finch, but another parallel I see is in the character sketches. In What Remains of Edith Finch, you get to experience a unique story from each character's perspective, and each of those experiences utilizes a different mechanic. I mentioned last episode that although it was impactful taking the role of that character and doing what they did, the actual mechanics weren't top-notch. Similarly, in the Hex, the games you play related to each character are important, but the actual gameplay isn't mind-blowing by any means. The gameplay is entertaining for a period, but the vignettes are there to give each character context, as well as to progress the main storyline. As much as I'd like to say that the gameplay was monumental, it really wasn't. It was the supporting actor in a movie focused on the narrative. Last but certainly not least, let's discuss the art and sound design. Like with the gameplay, it's a bit hard to evaluate the art when the graphical styles and perspectives were constantly changing. There's 3D sequences, 2D top-down sections, and 2D side-scrolling areas. What did remain fairly consistent though was the cartoony feel of the art. In the bar sections, the art almost felt like a South Park and Darkest Dungeon hybrid. It wasn't bad by any means, but again, like with the gameplay, because there were so many unique perspectives and art styles that Daniel had to cover, the game didn't really showcase any of them in a standout way. They all just ended up being mediocre in their look and feel. There is something to be said though for the tone that the art styles convey. They evoke more of a comical feel which does play into the narrative. However, I still think that the game would have just improved across the board if there had been better art. On the sound design side, I think Jonah did a solid job. Most of the characters didn't have voiceover. They spoke in a sort of mumbled sound, but those sounds were unique to each character. There also was a bit of voiceover near the end, and that voice actor did a great job. The rest of the sound effects also helped to improve the game. Like I mentioned in our narrative discussion, this game took me on an emotional ride, and I think it was primarily due to the story and sounds. Now that we've made it through the narrative, gameplay, art, and sound design, let's summarize the positives and negatives of the Hex. On the positive side, first and foremost, the narrative was incredible, unexpected, and weird as hell. It gave me chills, and my mind continues to wander back to what exactly took place. This is one of those games that truly does something unique in a narrative sense, and you have to play it to understand that fully. Second, the meta humor was hilarious. Not only was the humor accessible to non-gamers, I believe it was also amplified if you've been gaming for a while. Third, I think the sound design was on point. This game is a wonderful example of how sound design doesn't need to have an incredible orchestral score or a famous voice actor to be impactful. On the negative side, there are two standouts. Although I was impressed with what Daniel was able to do with such a simple control scheme, I would have enjoyed much more complex mechanics for all of the games. I can definitely see where it was probably a struggle to design this game. Each character sequence was just long enough to crave more interesting gameplay, but probably too short for Daniel to justify creating deeper systems. In the end, this created pretty shallow mechanical play throughout a majority of the game. There were moments where puzzles felt fully fleshed out, but those moments were few and far between. The second negative I have is in relation to the art. Similar to my gripes about the mechanics, I felt like Daniel was spread too thin, and as a result there was a lot of mediocre visuals. I don't want to be too harsh, but it was easy to see that Daniel was very honed in on the narrative and immersion aspects of the game, and less on everything else. We've made it now to the final boss. This is the part of the podcast where I let you know whether you should slay the game and buy it, flee the game and avoid it, or farm up and wait for a sale. This was a tough decision because I personally loved this game. Sure, a game like Dead Cells is amazing because of how tight and smooth the mechanical play is, but in terms of a unique experience, the Hex beats out Dead Cells and other games like that any day. That being said, my verdict is split between slaying and fleeing. This is where my opinion matters less, and you have to evaluate your gaming preferences. If you're someone who likes to play games primarily for solid mechanics and interesting art, and the narrative experience and immersion aspects are less important to you, I would recommend you flee this game. However, if you're someone who's searching for unique experiences in gaming, and gameplay is secondary to that search, I highly recommend that you slay the Hex. As always, thank you all for taking the time to listen in. This was an incredibly fun game to play through in preparation for the show, and I hope you had just as much fun listening in to my thoughts. If you enjoy the show and haven't already, I want to encourage you to head on over to iTunes to give the show a 5-star review. Even if you listen on a completely different app, a 5-star review on iTunes is huge for helping boost the podcast. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll see you in-game.